Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. Let's just jump right in, shall we? Today, we are focusing squarely on Grade 8 history, specifically Lesson 4, Explorations and Arrival of the Europeans in the East. And we're going to zero in on Section 4.2, Receiving State Patronage for Explorations. If you've ever wondered how the modern map of the world was actually drawn, and maybe more importantly, who on earth paid to draw it, well, you are absolutely in the right place. Here is our quick roadmap for today. First up, the blocked trade routes. 2. The need for sponsors. 3. God, glory, and gold. 4. Portugal leads the way. 5. Spain enters the race. And finally, a changed world map. All right, kicking things off with Section 1, the blocked trade routes, a Mediterranean monopoly. So, before the late 15th century, European trade was massively reliant on the Mediterranean Sea, the Red Sea, and that famous overland path, the Silk Route. These paths were basically the lifelines used to bring incredibly valuable Asian goods, especially spices, straight into booming European commercial cities like Venice and Genoa. It was a thriving, predictable system. But then, boom, a huge catalyst changes literally everything. Imagine your normal, everyday route to the grocery store is suddenly blocked by a giant brick wall. You still desperately need groceries, right? But your only way to get them is completely cut off. Well, that's exactly what happened back then. The city of Constantinople, which was this massive commercial hub, got conquered by the Turks. Almost overnight, the traditional trade routes Europeans had relied on for ages were just walled off. Asian trade dominance shifted firmly into the hands of Muslim traders, who obviously acted as middlemen and made some pretty hefty profits. So Europeans are now facing this massive economic crisis. They desperately need those spices, but their access is gone. They literally had no choice but to look outward, braving the dangerous, totally uncharted oceans just to find completely new sea routes to Asia. Which brings us to Section 2, the need for sponsors. Who pays the bill? Now, it's one thing to just say, hey, let's sail across the ocean, but how on earth do you afford it? Why would a king pay for a highly dangerous sea voyage? Think about it kind of like this. A high school student can't just fund a multi-million-dollar robotics project out of their own pocket, right? They need a sponsor, like a bank, a university, or an adult with some serious capital. In the 15th century, individual explorers, no matter how brave or brilliant they were, just didn't have the personal wealth to buy their own ships, hire a huge crew, and buy months' worth of supplies, especially for a voyage that had zero guarantee of them ever returning, let alone making a profit. And that brings us to a super important vocabulary term for today, state patronage. Since individuals couldn't foot this massive bill, emerging national governments in Europe had to step in. State patronage is simply when these powerful governments provide the huge funding and backing required for these high-risk, long-term explorations. Countries like Portugal, Spain, and eventually England became these giant sponsors. Honestly, without the extremely deep pockets of these states, these famous voyages would have literally never left the dock. Moving right along to Section 3, God, Glory, and Gold, the motivations. Okay, so why take on that huge financial risk? This quote pretty much perfectly captures the vibe of the era. Right after arriving in India, the famous explorer Vasco da Gama said, "We have come here in search of Christians and spices." It completely nails the dual motives the Europeans had. The spices part represents the massive economic intention. The intense desire to seize trade dominance and rake in immense wealth. And the Christians part? That represents the religious intention, the goal of spreading Christianity into all these newly discovered lands. And fun fact, this actually ties into a really wild historical myth that fueled a lot of these voyages. Many Europeans actually believed there was this legendary Christian state located somewhere out in the east, ruled by a super powerful leader named Prester John. I know, right? But it's true. A major reason governments funded these massive ships was the genuine hope of actually finding Prester John, teaming up with him, and spreading Christianity worldwide. It was this crazy mix of extreme economic desperation and really deep religious conviction. All right, Section 4, Portugal leads the way, masters of the sea. Let's meet the first major competitor in our historical race. Portugal was incredibly well-positioned to lead this whole era. Because they were geographically situated right on the edge of the Iberian Peninsula, they pretty much had to handle all their foreign relationships by sea. They just didn't have massive land connections stretching to the east. So out of pure necessity, the Portuguese were already naturally skilled navigators long before Constantinople even fell. But they definitely didn't just coast on natural talent. the Portuguese state heavily sponsored a very systematic approach. This royal figure, Henry the Navigator, actually started a literal school of oceanic navigation in the 15th century. Thanks to state patronage, he rigorously trained people in 4 crucial steps: navigation, shipbuilding, so the boats wouldn't get crushed in the high seas, studying maps, and astronomy. Astronomy was absolutely huge because it allowed them to use tools like the compass and track the angle of the North Star to accurately guide those super long voyages. So let's see how all this prep work paid off. You can clearly see the huge payoff of Portugal's state patronage over time. It kicks off with Henry's school in the 15th century. Then, by the later 15th century, the explorer Bartolomeu Diaz manages to sail all the way down to the southern tip of Africa, which he named the Cape of Storms, though the king later rebranded it as the much nicer sounding Cape of Good Hope. And then finally, in 1498, building on all the work before him, Vasco da Gama follows that route all the way around Africa and successfully reaches Calicut, India. Boom! Portugal had officially won the race to find the new sea route to Asia. Which brings us to Section 5. Spain enters the race. A rivalry begins. Well, you can't exactly have a race with only one runner, can you? Spain, which is Portugal's largest neighbor on the Iberian Peninsula, wasn't about to just sit around watching Portugal get all the glory, the trade dominance, and of course, all those spices. By the second half of the 15th century, Spain was emerging as a really strong, financially stable state, led by a powerful royal couple, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. With a totally booming economy, the Spanish government eagerly stepped up to offer their own state patronage. They were more than ready to fund some explorations, but they kind of needed a totally different angle. So, let's compare these two massive gambles. Portugal's strategy, which they had pretty much perfected by now, was to sail south and east, carefully hugging the African coast. Spain, on the other hand, decided to fund a totally different, incredibly risky approach. They decided they were going to sail west, straight across the vast, completely unknown Atlantic Ocean, basically hoping to wrap all the way around the globe and hit Asia from the back door. It really highlights how state patronage gave explorers the cash to actually test out wildly different scientific and geographical theories. And that Spanish patronage led directly to the year 1492, when an explorer you might just have heard of, Christopher Columbus, set sail under the funding of Ferdinand and Isabella. Following that whole Western strategy, he eventually landed on Hispaniola Island in the Bahamas. Now, here's the funny part. Columbus genuinely thought he had reached India. It's this massive historical irony, and it's exactly why we still call that Caribbean region the West Indies today. In their attempt to find a state-sponsored route to Asian spices, Spain completely accidentally opened up European access to the Americas. And our final section today, Section 6, A Changed World Map, The Legacy of Patronage. All right, the absolute biggest takeaway from this entire explainer is connecting the dots between the brave individual and the powerful state. You see, famous faces like Vasco da Gama, Christopher Columbus, and later on Ferdinand Magellan, they wouldn't even be in our history books if emerging national governments hadn't fronted the massive cash for their ships. It was this exact combination of courageous individuals and massive state funding that allowed Europeans to discover entirely new lands in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. It literally transformed human history forever. Before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a bit of a provocative thought to chew on. Think about the wild, uncharted 15th century oceans, kind of like modern space exploration. If today's astronauts and scientists had to personally pay out of pocket for their own rockets and space stations, what parts of our universe would remain completely undiscovered? State patronage was the vital fuel for massive discovery back then, just like it is right now. Thank you so much for hanging out with me for this explainer on Grade 8 history. Keep exploring, keep asking big questions, and I'll catch you next time.